Welcome to the Texas Revolution, a study guide. In the early 1800s, few people lived in the area we now call Texas, and the Mexicans who did live there were called Tejanos. It remained a part of Spain until 1821, when Mexico gained its independence from Spain. Before the Mexican Revolution, Spain wanted to encourage people to populate this area called Texas. Spain hoped that increasing the population would be a boost to the Spanish economy, so they offered the chance for people to obtain land grants. Someone who received a land grant was called an impresario and was expected to recruit new settlers to live on their land. In 1820, an American named Moses Austin asked the Spanish for a land grant to establish a colony in Texas. Moses Austin became the first impresario to receive a land grant in 1821. Moses was forced to go to Mexico City to pick up his land grant, a harsh and long journey. On the trip, Moses fell ill. Although he picked up the land grant and made it back home, he never recovered and died 2 months later. On his deathbed, he gave his land grant and the job of setting up the Texas colony to his son, Stephen Fuller Austin. Before Stephen Austin could set up his colony, Mexico fought a revolution against Spain and gained its independence. Austin would have to renegotiate his land grant with the new Mexican government and hope they honored his claim. He was forced to wait a year before finding out that his land grant would be honored, and he was given permission to start recruiting settlers for his new colony. Stephen immediately put out advertisements in flyers and newspapers asking for settlers to join him. He ended up with 300 American families who agreed to settle in Texas. Mexico required several things from each person immigrating to Texas. They had to pay for the land, become Mexican citizens, obey Mexican laws, and join the Catholic Church. The settlers agreed to these restrictions, and Austin gave them directions to Texas. In truth, many of the settlers would have said anything for the chance to move to Texas. Most had no intention of actually following these rules. Most of the settlers were from the South and hoped to start their own cotton plantations, but times were very hard while they were building the colony. A lack of resources, money, and attacks by Native Americans sent many settlers back to America. Stephen Austin himself almost went broke. By the 1830s, his colony was thriving. It had grown to about 20,000 residents, including some squatters who came to Texas and just claimed land without ever paying Mexico or Austin for it. Many of the later settlers to the colony refused to join the Catholic Church or follow Mexican laws. Understandably, this angered the Mexican government. By 1830, Americans outnumbered Mexicans 10-1 in Texas. Hoping to stop the takeover of Texas, in 1830 the Mexican government closed the border to America and forbid any further immigration. Mexico also passed a tax on all American goods entering Texas, began to strictly enforce Mexican laws using military force, banned any religion except Catholicism, passed high taxes, and limited slavery, eventually banning it completely. Of all of these actions, the ban on slavery most upset the settlers. Many hoped to grow cotton and felt they needed their slaves. The Texans, who were most outraged by Mexico's actions, formed the War Party and were ready to fight to keep slavery and their land. Austin tried to use diplomacy to stop the conflict and went to Mexico City to negotiate with the government over slaves and taxes. Unfortunately, he wrote some letters telling Texans to be ready to declare independence if things didn't go well, and some of his letters fell into the hands of the Mexican government. Austin was arrested and thrown in jail for a year and a half. This was a big mistake on the part of the Mexican government, as Austin was probably the only man who could have stopped armed conflict in Texas. But after spending a year and a half in a Mexican jail, he was more than ready to join the fight. In 1832, Mexico gained a new president, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. In 1833, Santa Anna agreed to remove the ban on American settlers, but refused to change the political status of Texas. Santa Anna then went from president to dictator and overthrew Mexico's constitution. In 1835, Santa Anna took away all rights from Texans. He followed that up by stationing military troops in many Texas towns to try to control their actions and enforce his laws. In October of 1835, Texans drove back Mexican troops in Gonzales when they tried to take the cannon Texans used to defend their town. In December of 1835, Texans also liberated or freed the town of San Antonio from Mexican forces. Santa Anna was furious over the loss of San Antonio and marched his army north, reaching San Antonio in February of 1836. A small force of Texans was barricaded inside a nearby mission called the Alamo. Jim Bowie had been sent by Sam Houston to destroy the Alamo so the Mexican army could not use it, but instead he tried to hold it against Santa Anna, who demanded the Texans surrender. The Texans opened fire on Santa Anna's army and the Battle of the Alamo began. For 13 days, Santa Anna's army bombarded the walls of the Alamo until they were finally able to break down or climb over them. Inside the Alamo, the Texans were overwhelmed by the Mexican army. Once Santa Anna was inside, he ordered every remaining Texan killed. In response to the loss of the Alamo, on March 2, 1836, Texans met on Washington on the Brazos and declared their independence and established the Republic of Texas. Following his success at the Alamo, Santa Anna turned his sights on Goliad. Sam Houston ordered a Texan retreat from the town, but General Fannin waited too long and the men were overrun by the Mexican troops and forced to surrender. The surrendered Texans were marched to Santa Anna, who ordered most of them shot. Santa Anna hoped the defeat at the Alamo and Goliad would crush the morale of the Texans and stop the revolution, but it did just the opposite. Texans used these defeats as a rallying cry to fight even harder, yelling, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" On April 21, 1836, Sam Houston organized his troops to attack Santa Anna, who was with his men in San Jacinto. The battle only lasted 18 minutes. 600 Mexicans were killed and 700 captured because Santa Anna was taken by surprise after he had separated himself from his larger force. Santa Anna was captured and forced to sign a treaty granting Texas its independence. But the Republic of Texas still had problems. As soon as Santa Anna returned to Mexico City, he and his government declared the treaty to be illegal, and they refused to honor it. Texas itself was nearly bankrupt by this time. Despite all this, Santa Anna did not continue to attack the Texans, fearing war with America. Most Texans wanted the U.S. to annex or take control of Texas and make it a part of the Union. Also, most Southerners wanted Texas to be annexed. Northerners, however, did not want to add another pro-slavery state to the Union. President Andrew Jackson wanted to avoid war with Mexico, so he decided not to annex Texas. The victory over Mexico by the Texans only gave them a small chunk of Mexican land. The vast majority of the Southwest was still owned by Mexico. Manifest Destiny, however, would have something to say about that. And now you have a little bit of information about the Texas Revolution, at least from the American perspective.